Yes, slightly later tonight, as I did decide to to tune that down to 5 minutes of sitting around before stream. Hopefully, this creates a bit less downtime for the VODs as well. Should be cool and good. But for now, we wait and we see who all turns up. Yes, thank you, Stream Elements. I am in fact live. How was People's Day? I found myself not doing much. Well, that's not true. I got more work on the treehouse done, and I got more work on the well, not application anymore, but setup done. Sounds like a party. Sounds like a party. I'll make sure to announce this again at end of stream, but I will not be streaming this coming Monday due to the holiday and due to my own celebrations of said holiday. I still plan on streaming Sunday. You know, the holiday. Are you getting a holiday weekend, Snuggle? It doesn't sound like it. It is, of course, the holiday I speak of being My Bucket's Got a Hole in It Day. Everybody's favorite holiday. Well, we can endeavor to liven up your day slightly, perhaps. How would one do that? Well, I don't know. But we've hit 9:30, so it's reading time. Today we've got chapters 8 and 9. probably, assuming we do all that. But for now, Chapter 8. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings, one a smiling babe full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered, by the solemnity of her feelings, exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands. For all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, and as her confusion had been before abducted as proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court she threw her eyes round it, and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which the murder had committed, and towards the morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely, and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly if anyone had been heard concerning him. When shown the body, she fell into violent hysterics, and kept to her bed for several days. The picture was then produced which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which, an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed around his neck, a murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defence. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, although variable, voice. God knows, she said, how I entirely am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts that have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation where any circumstances appear doubtful or suspicious. She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt at Cheyne, a village situated about a league from Geneva. On her return, at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account, and passed several hours looking for him, when the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwilling to call upon the inhabitants, to whom she was well known. Most of the night she spent there watching. Towards morning she believed that she slept for a few minutes. Some steps disturbed her, and she awoke. It was dawn, and she quitted her asylum, and she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night, and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture she could give no account. I know, considered the unhappy victim, how heavily and fatally this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the possibilities of which it might have been placed in my pocket. But here also I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know, for no opportunity afforded him doing so. Or, if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of the judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime for which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forwards. Elizabeth saw even this last resource, her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct, about to fail the accused, when, though violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. "I am," said she, "the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and having lived with his parents ever since and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forwards on this occasion, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5 and at another for nearly 2 years. During all that period she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness, with the greatest affection and care, afterwards attending her own mother during a tedious time in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her, after which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action as to have the bauble with which the chief proof rests. If she earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her, as so much do I esteem and value her." A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference, and not in favor of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went on to the court. My lips and throat were parched. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I have endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expressions, but words cannot convey the idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. The evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case, but I am glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive. This was a strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me? And was I really as mad as the whole world would believe me to be if I disclosed the object of my suspicions? I hastened to return home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. "My cousin," replied I, "it is decided that you may have expected. All judges had rather that 10 innocent should suffer than 1 guilty should escape, but she has confessed." This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. "Alas!" said she, "how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or guile, yet she has committed a murder." Soon after, we heard the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone." The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber, and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the farther end. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. "Oh, Justine," said she, "why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now. And do you believe that I am so very, very wicked? Do you join me in your enemies to crush me, to condemn me as a murderer?" Her voice was suffocated with sobs. "Rise, my poor girl," said Elizabeth. "Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you yourself had declared your guilt. That report, if you say, is false, and be sure, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment but your own confession." "I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, for now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me! Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hell fire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable." She paused, weeping, and then continued, "I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honoured, and whom you loved, as a creature capable of crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, a dearest blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we shall be happy, and that consoles me. I going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having for one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, dear girl, do not fear. I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemies by my tears and prayers. You shall not die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my sister, perish on the scaffold. No, no, I could never survive so horrible a misfortune." Justine shook her head mournfully. "I do not fear to die," she said. "That pang is past. God raises my weakness and gives me courage to endure the worst. I leave this sad, bitter world, and if you remember me and think of me as one unjustly condemned, I am resigned to the fate waiting me. Learn from me, dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven." During this conversation I had retired to a corner of the present room, where I could conceal the horrid anguish that possessed me. Despair! Who dared talk of that? The poor victim, who on the morrow was to pass the awful boundary between life and death, felt not, as I did, such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, uttering a groan that came from my inmost soul. Justine started. Then she saw who it was. She approached me, and said, "Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty." I could not answer. "No, Justine," said Elizabeth. "He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it. I truly thank him. In these last moments I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I! It removes more than half my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and your cousin." Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed me no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers was the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, was for a while hides, but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. "I wish," cried she, "that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she was difficulty repressing her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth, and said in a low voice of half suppressed emotion, "Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so." And on the morrow Justine died. Elizabeth's heart-rending eloquence failed to move the judges from their settled conviction in the criminality of the saintly sufferer. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost upon them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh, unfeeling reasoning of these men, my purpose avowal died away on my lips. Thus I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence passed upon my wretched victim. She perished on the scaffold as a murderess. From the torture of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. This was also my doing, and my father's woe, and the desolation of that late so smiling home, all was the work of my thrice accursed hands. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early, much loved friend, he who would spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who has no thought nor sense of joy except as mirrored also in your dear countenances, who would fill the air with blessings and spend his life in serving you. He bids you weep to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes, if thus inexorable fate be satisfied, if the destruction pause before the peace of the grave have succeeded to your sad torments. Thus I spoke my prophetic soul, as torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims of my unhallowed arts. That's chapter. So I'm gonna take a break and take a drink of water, as the usual. I'm back. Time to catch up on chat. You guys have been talking. Oh, goodness. You guys have been talking. Thank you for tuning in, Poppy. Always nice to see you. I hope that goes well. That's I don't know. Nice to see. Fun. Also, Frog Cowboy. Thank you for the follow. That's a good name. And for now, on to chapter 9. Nothing is more painful to the human mind than, after the feelings have been worked to quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died, and she rested, and I was alive, and the blood flowed freely in my veins, but the weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description. Horrible and more, much more, I persuaded myself, was yet behind. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life with benevolent intentions, and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice, and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now all was blasted. Instead of that serenity of conscience which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hopes, I was seized by remorse, and the sense of guilt which hurried me away to hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. This state of mind preyed upon my health, which had perhaps never entirely recovered from the first shock it had sustained. I shunned the face of man. All sound of joy or complacency was torture to me. Solitude was my only consolation. Deep, dark, death-like solitude. I'm actually going to take another drink. Give me a second. Do, 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 do. Do, do. Do, do. All right, thank you. My apologies. Yes. My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored, by arguments deduced from the feelings of his serene conscience and lifeless and guiltless life, to inspire me with fortitude and awaken in me the courage to dispel the dark cloud which brooded over me. Do you think, Victor, said he, that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother. Tears came into his eyes as he spoke. But it is not duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief. It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. This advice, although good, was totally inapplicable to my case. I should have been the first to hide my grief and console my friends if remorse had not mingled its bitterness, and terror its alarm, with my other sensations. Now I could only answer my father with a look of despair and endeavor to hide myself from his view. About this time we retired to our house in Belrive. This change was particularly agreeable to me. The shutting of the gates regularly at 10 o'clock, and the impossibility of the remaining on the lake after the hour had rendered our residence within the walls of Geneva very irksome to me. I was now free. Often, after the rest of my family had retired for the night, I took the boat and passed many hours upon the water. Sometimes, with my sails set, I was carried by the wind, and sometimes, after rowing into the middle of the lake, I left the boat to pursue its own course, and gave way to my own miserable reflections. I was often tempted, when all was at peace around me, and I the only unquiet thing that wandered restless in a serene so beautiful and heavily, if I except some bat or the frogs, whose harsh and interrupted croaking was heard only when I approached the shore. Often, I say, I was tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities for ever. But I was restrained when I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved, and whose existence was bound up in mine. I thought also of my father and surviving brother. Should I, by my base desertion, leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had set let loose among them? At these moments I wept bitterly, and wished that peace would revisit my mind, only that I might afford them consolation and happiness. But that could not be. Remorse extinguished every hope. I had been the author of unalterable evils, and I lived in daily fear lest the monster whom I had created should perpetrate some new wickedness. I had an obscure feeling that was not over and that he would still commit some signal crime, which by its enormity should almost efface the recollection of the past. There was always scope for fear so long as anything I loved remained behind. My abhorrence of this fiend cannot be conceived. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth, my eyes became inflamed, and I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. When I reflected on his crimes and malice, my hatred and revenge burst all bounds of moderation. I would have made a pilgrimage to the highest peaks of the Andes could I, when there, have precipitated him to their base. I wished to see him again, that I might wreak the utmost extent of abhorrence on his head, and avenge the deaths of William and Justine. Our house was a house of mourning. My father's health was deeply shaken by the horror of the recent events. Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege towards the dead eternal woe, and tears she then thought that she was just tribute she should pay innocence so blasted and destroyed. She was no longer that happy creature who in earlier youth had wandered with me to the banks of the lake, and talked with ecstasy of our future prospects. The first of these sorrows which were sent to us to wean us from the earth had visited her, and its dimming influence quenched her dearest smiles. "When I reflect, my dear cousin," she said, "on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. At least they were remote and more familiar to reason than to the imagination. But now misery has come home, and men appear to me as monsters thirsting for each other's blood. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everyone believes that poor girl to be guilty, and if sorry, I have something in my eye. I have lost my spot because of it. Mm, oh, that's what I get for kicking up so much sawdust today. Where was I? Where was I? Choo-choo-choo. Yet I am certainly unjust. Everyone believed that poor girl to be guilty, and if she could have committed the crime for which she suffered, assuredly she would have been the most depraved of human creatures. For the sake of a few jewels to have murdered the son of her benefactor and friend, a child whom she nursed from its birth, and would appear to love if it had been her own. I could not consent to the death of any human being, but certainly I should have thought such a creature unfit to remain in society of men. But she was innocent. I feel she was innocent. You are of the same opinion, and that confirms me. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as though we were walking on the edge of precipice, towards which thousands of crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss. William and Justin were assassinated, the murderer escapes, and he walks about the world free, and perhaps respected. But even if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for the same crimes, I could not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not in deed but in effect, was the true murderer. Elizabeth read my anguish in my countenance, and kindly taking my hand, said, "My dearest friend, you must calm yourself. These events have affected me, God knows how deeply, but I am not so wretched as you are. There is an expression of despair, and sometimes of revenge, in your countenance that makes me tremble. Dear Victor, banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you who centre all their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Ah, while we love, while we are true to each other here in this land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing, and what can disturb our peace?" And could not such words from her whom I fondly prized before every other gift or fortune suffice to chase away the fiend that lurked in my heart? Even as she spoke, I drew near to her as if in terror lest at that very moment the destroyer had been near to rob her of me. Thus, not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of the earth, nor the heaven could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud with no beneficial influence could penetrate. The wounded deer dragging its fainting limbs to some untrodden brake, there to graze upon the arrow which had pierced it, and to die, but was but a type of me. Sometimes I would cope with the sullen despair that overwhelmed me, but sometimes the whirlwind passions of my soul drove me to seek, by bodily exercise and by change of place, some relief from my intolerable sensations. It was during an access of this kind that I suddenly left my home, and bending my steps towards the near Alpine valleys, sought in the magnificence, the eternity of such scenes, to forget myself and my ephemeral, because human, sorrows. My wanderings were directed towards the valley of Chamonix. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. 6 years had passed since then. I was a wreck, but naught had changed in these savage and enduring scenes. I performed the first part of my journey on horseback. Afterwards I hired a mule, as the more sure-footed and least liable to receive injury on these rugged roads. The weather was fine. It was the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine, that miserable epoch from which I dated all my woe. The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper into the ravine of Arve. The immense mountains and precipices that overhung me on either side, the sound of the river raging against the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around spoke of the mighty power as omnipotence, and I ceased to fear or to bend before any being less almighty than that which had created and ruled the elements, here displayed in their most terrific guise. Still, as I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character. Ruined castles hanging on the precipices of piny mountains, and the impetuous Arve, the cottages here and there peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty, but it was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another earth, the inhabitants of another race of beings. I passed the bridge to Pelissier, where the ravine which the river forms opened before me, and I began to ascend the mountain that overhangs it. Soon after, I entered the valley of Chamonix. This valley was more wonderful and sublime, but not so beautiful and picturesque as all of Cervo, which I had just passed. The high and snowy mountains were in immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche, and marked the smoke of its passage. Mount Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mount Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding aiguilleries, and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. Oh, I don't know if you can hear that, but it's raining now. Uh, oh goodness, it's raining quite a bit. I do hope the microphone isn't picking that up. We shall see. Yes. A tingling, long lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognized, reminded me of days gone by, were associated with the light-hearted gaiety of boyhood. The very winds whispered in soothing accents, and maternal nature bade me weep no more. Then again the kindly influence ceased to act. I found myself fettered again to grief, and indulged in all the misery of reflection. Then I spurred on my animal, striving so to forget the world, my fears, and more than all, myself, or, in a more desperate fashion, I lighted and threw myself on the grass, weighted down by horror and despair. At length I arrived in the village of Chamonix. Exhaustion succeeded to the extreme fatigue, both of body and of mind, which I had endured. For a short space of time I remained at the window, watching the pallid lightnings that played above Mont Blanc, and listening to the rushing of the Arve, which pursued its noisy way beneath. The same lulling sounds acted as a lullaby to my too keen senses. When I placed my head upon the pillow, sleep crept over me. I felt as it came, and blessed the giver of oblivion. So that is the end of chapter 9. And given that it is 10:01, that is the end of reading for tonight. What do we think? Any comments on this particular chapter? Justine, though innocent, has been put to death. And our protagonist, Mr. Frankenstein, doesn't feel great about that, suffice say. No, yes, well, I have to stop reading at some point, and I don't, and I do quite like the pace of two chapters a day. Snuggle, if it's something that you're gonna make like sexual, I don't. Okay, fine. The cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered. Yes, well, Victor does enjoy saying words, doesn't he? He's quite fond of them. And I have now double checking. It appears as though my it appears as though my microphone is not picking up the rain. Everything I say isn't sexual, Sag. Yes, well, Snuggle, I know what to expect by now from you. So I'm afraid I must warn you off on occasion. Hmm. So, well, in this specific case, I cannot trust you. My apologies. But I have 2 minutes until the 40 minute mark, so I can wait around if people have comments, questions about this particular chapter. As is the stream schedule, I will be taking off on Friday and also Saturday night, but I will be back Sunday. And as I stated at the beginning of the stream, I will be taking Monday off due to the national holiday. There's a hole in my bucket day. Thank you for understanding. It's very important to me, and I must make sure to observe the holiday. Mm-hmm. 1 minute left. And then I think I will raid Bean, as she is still alive, and she's a person. Big fan of those, personally, as an also person. Big fan of those. I also apologize in this particular VOD if you heard a bunch of noise when I was trying to get sawdust in my out of my eye. Do you think Victor eased his pain enough? Huh? Well, I think that he blames himself for a lot of things, for which he should, probably. Um, I think that if I had a son and my son decided to kill my brother and that murder was pinned on a good friend of mine, I'd feel pretty bad about it too, really. Uh, so, I cannot say that this situation has happened to me before, but I would consider it not a great one to be in, personally. It's definitely a hot take. Yes, well, I am full of those. Follow for more hot takes. Now, however, uh, I would remind people that since we had a new follower today, I would remind people that there is a Discord server if you would like to join it for updates on when I go live. And also, if you would like to recommend books for me to read, I haven't plugged it in a while. And that there's also a YouTube channel, which you can go and see the VODs. I am, let's see, this is chapter 10. And how many pages? There are 24. So we are almost halfway through Frankenstein. Uh, so I upload all these VODs to YouTube if you would like to catch up on the earlier Frankenstein. And have I have already finished Gatsby if you would like to go back and listen to that. But for now, this has been what was today? Chapters 8 and 9 of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I will get that raid ready.